There are certain days that arrive quietly, without thunder, without warning. Yet the moment you wake up, you can feel that something inside reality itself has shifted. Today is one of those days. This is not ordinary emotional energy passing through your life for a few fleeting hours. What unfolds on May 18th, 2026, carries the kind of emotional gravity that pulls buried feelings back to the surface, whether you are prepared for them or not. And if your heart has felt suspended between holding on and finally letting go, if someone from your past has been appearing in your thoughts with unusual intensity lately, then what is happening in the sky right now may explain everything. Venus, the planet that governs love, longing, attraction, intimacy, affection, and emotional fulfillment, is stepping into Cancer today. But this movement is far deeper than a simple planetary transition. This is Venus entering the sign where emotional attachment becomes sacred, where love stops performing and starts protecting, where vulnerability no longer feels dangerous but necessary. It is Venus returning to a frequency that understands emotional security on the deepest possible level. And what makes this even more significant is that this shift is happening while several other major cosmic movements are simultaneously reshaping the emotional atmosphere around you, creating a powerful opening that does not appear often. Something rare is forming beneath the surface of this day, and many people will move through it completely unaware. But those who are emotionally sensitive, those who feel energy before they understand it logically, have already started noticing the signs. You may have caught yourself thinking about someone unexpectedly, not casually but intensely, as if their presence suddenly pushed itself back into your emotional field. Maybe memories have been resurfacing without permission. Maybe songs that once meant nothing now feel loaded with emotion. Maybe you have been sensing an unexplainable anticipation in your chest, like part of you already knows that your emotional reality is standing at the edge of a major turning point. This is not coincidence. The energetic wave of this transit began building long before today officially arrived. Planetary shifts like this do not suddenly appear out of nowhere. They move through the emotional body in advance, sending signals into the subconscious before the conscious mind can catch up. And what you have been feeling lately is evidence that your intuition already detected the change before your logic did. Over the past several weeks, Venus has been traveling through Gemini, shaping love through curiosity, conversation, and mental stimulation. During that phase, emotions may have felt scattered or difficult to anchor. Connections may have seemed exciting at first, yet emotionally inconsistent underneath. People talked more than they revealed. Feelings stayed suspended in uncertainty. Relationships became intellectual puzzles instead of emotional refuges. There may have been attraction, fascination, chemistry, but something essential remained missing. Depth, stability, emotional safety. And if you felt emotionally restless during this period, if part of you kept sensing that your heart wanted something more real than surface-level connection, that discomfort was not imagined. Your emotional body has been waiting for this exact shift. Because the moment Venus enters Cancer, love changes frequency entirely. Suddenly, the heart stops craving stimulation and starts craving sanctuary. What matters now is not who entertains you, but who understands you. Not who impresses you, but who makes your nervous system finally relax. This energy awakens the desire for a love that feels like home instead of performance. The desire to be seen without pretending, to be held emotionally without fear of abandonment, to feel chosen in a way that creates peace instead of anxiety. And this is where Cancer energy becomes far more powerful than most people realize. Cancer is constantly misunderstood because people reduce it to sensitivity alone. But Cancer is not weak energy. It is protective force. It is emotional leadership. It is the instinct to preserve what truly matters at all costs. As a cardinal sign, Cancer initiates emotional movement. It builds foundations, It creates belonging. It fights for connection when connection is genuine. This is the energy of someone who remembers every detail, because their heart experiences love as something sacred, not disposable. When Venus enters this sign, emotions become impossible to fake. Affection becomes fiercely loyal. Attachment deepens. And for many people, this transit reawakens emotional bonds they thought had already disappeared. Suddenly, old relationships do not feel fully finished anymore. The person who walked away begins occupying space in your thoughts again. Unresolved emotions start knocking against the walls you built to protect yourself. Because Cancer energy does not erase emotional history. It preserves it. It stores memories in the body, in the heart, in the subconscious. This is why certain people become impossible to forget during transits like this. Not because you are weak, but because this energy activates emotional truths you buried instead of healed. And now something inside you is beginning to recognize the difference. You are beginning to realize that some part of your heart has remained emotionally open this entire time, even if your mind convinced you otherwise. That realization alone can feel overwhelming. But it is also the beginning of emotional awakening. Because once Venus moves into Cancer, love stops asking superficial questions and starts asking the ones that truly matter. Who feels safe to your soul? Who still lives inside your emotional memory? Who do you instinctively protect even after distance? Who still has access to your heart, even in silence? These are the truths beginning to rise now. And the reason this energy feels so intense is because Cancer is ruled by the moon, which means every emotional current becomes amplified, intuitive, and deeply personal. The reason this energy feels impossible to escape right now is because the moon governs the hidden chambers of the human heart. It rules memory, instinct, emotional imprinting, and the part of you that remembers people long after your conscious mind claims you have let them go. So when Venus moves into Cancer, this transit does not merely influence your present desires. It reaches backward through your emotional timeline and touches every connection that ever left a permanent mark on your soul. Suddenly, the past no longer feels distant. Certain names begin echoing in your mind again. Certain memories start carrying emotional weight they did not have a few weeks ago. People you have not spoken to in months or even years begin surfacing in your dreams, your thoughts, your intuition. This is why old lovers tend to reappear during this transit without warning. Messages arrive unexpectedly. Coincidences increase. You may find yourself revisiting conversations, photographs, or emotional moments you genuinely believed were over. But the truth is, Cancer energy does not operate through emotional detachment. It operates through emotional return. Venus in Cancer does not view love as something disposable or temporary. It views real connection as something that leaves a permanent imprint. And that is exactly why today carries such enormous emotional significance. Because what is happening in the sky is not a single isolated transit. It is a chain reaction. A perfectly timed emotional convergence that intensifies hour by hour. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, Mars shifts into Taurus. Less than 3 hours later, at approximately 9:09, Venus enters Cancer. Then, only around 40 minutes after that, at approximately 9:45, the Moon also enters Cancer. 3 major energetic transitions unfolding almost back-to-back within the same day. This is not random cosmic movement. This is orchestration. It is as though the emotional atmosphere itself is being redesigned in real time. And the reason you feel emotionally overwhelmed, restless, sensitive, or strangely hopeful right now is because your nervous system is already responding to the shift before your conscious mind fully understands it. Mars entering Taurus immediately changes the pace of emotional action. The frantic chasing energy begins dissolving. The impulsiveness softens. Suddenly, people crave stability instead of temporary excitement. There is a deeper desire to build something enduring rather than pursue emotional games that lead nowhere. Taurus energy slows everything down so intentions can become more deliberate, grounded, and trustworthy. This transit pushes people to stop running from emotional truth and start considering what actually has long-term value. Then Venus enters Cancer, and the emotional walls begin collapsing. The desire for emotional safety becomes impossible to ignore. People start craving intimacy that feels nurturing instead of performative. Vulnerability stops feeling like weakness and starts feeling like relief. And when the moon itself enters Cancer shortly afterward, the emotional volume rises dramatically because the moon rules Cancer naturally. This is its home frequency, its emotional territory, which means every hidden feeling, every suppressed longing, every unresolved attachment becomes amplified beyond what most people can comfortably avoid. This is why the energy surrounding today feels almost magnetic. Even individuals who know nothing about astrology are sensing that something emotional is shifting beneath the surface of reality. They may feel more nostalgic, more emotionally reactive, more aware of what their heart truly misses, but they cannot explain why. You, however, are beginning to understand the deeper mechanism behind it. And that awareness gives you emotional clarity, while others remain confused by what they are suddenly feeling. Astrologers are calling this moment a kind of emotional singularity, because the concentration of emotional energy becomes so intense that it creates a gravitational pull around relationships, memories, reconciliation, and healing. But there is another layer to this transit that elevates everything even further. Jupiter is already in Cancer right now, and Jupiter functions exceptionally well in this sign because Cancer is one of its exalted placements. This matters more than most people realize. Jupiter governs expansion, blessings, abundance, growth, faith, optimism, and emotional restoration. When Jupiter is exalted, its ability to amplify emotional experiences becomes extraordinarily powerful. And where is all that expansive energy being directed now? Into your emotional world, into your relationships, into your capacity to reconnect, forgive, soften, and emotionally heal. So when Venus enters Cancer and joins forces with both the Moon and exalted Jupiter, something extraordinary happens. Emotional possibilities that once felt blocked suddenly become accessible again. Reconciliation no longer feels impossible. Healing no longer feels distant. The idea of a second chance begins feeling emotionally real instead of imaginary. And what makes this transit so profound is that it does not require force. It does not reward manipulation or emotional control. It rewards openness, receptivity, emotional honesty, the willingness to stop protecting yourself so aggressively that love can no longer reach you. This is why many people will experience emotional breakthroughs during this period that they never expected. Because the emotional jackpot being created here is not about material gain. It is about the heart finally receiving what it has secretly needed for a very long time. It is about the possibility that someone who once broke your trust may finally return with the maturity and emotional courage they lacked before. It is about realizing that the walls you built after disappointment may no longer be necessary. And for certain zodiac signs, this energy becomes especially life-changing. Cancer, in particular, stands directly at the center of this transformation. With both Venus and the Moon entering your first house, while Jupiter has already been expanding your identity and self-worth, your entire emotional presence begins shifting. People notice you differently now, not because you are trying harder, but because your energy itself becomes more emotionally radiant. There is something deeply magnetic about you during this period, something difficult to explain logically. Others feel emotionally drawn toward you instinctively. Past lovers may suddenly find themselves unable to stop thinking about you. New connections may appear unexpectedly, carrying an emotional familiarity that feels almost destined. But the greatest transformation happening is internal. You begin remembering your value again. The insecurity that convinced you that you were too emotional, too complicated, or somehow unworthy of lasting love begins dissolving. For the first time in a long while, you start recognizing yourself beneath the pain, beneath the rejection, beneath the emotional armor you built to survive disappointment. And if there is someone from your past who left because the timing failed, because fear got in the way, or because emotional readiness was missing before, this transit may reopen a door you believed had permanently closed. And the most important part of this return is that it does not arrive carrying shallow promises or emotionally empty apologies. The energy surrounding this transit is not supporting performative regret. It is demanding emotional maturity. So if someone from your past begins moving back toward you now, it is because something inside them has shifted in a way they can no longer ignore. They finally understand the emotional value of what they lost. They finally recognize that the kind of loyalty, emotional depth, and unconditional care you offered was not ordinary. It was rare, and the painful realization that they walked away from something genuine has likely been haunting them far longer than you realize. But this is where the universe turns its attention back to you, Cancer, because this transit is not only about whether someone returns. It is about whether your heart is truly ready to open again after everything it endured. You spent so much time teaching yourself how not to need them. You built emotional armor layer by layer after disappointment, forced you to believe that protecting yourself was safer than hoping again. So now that the energy is shifting, now that reconciliation and emotional restoration suddenly feel possible, a deeper question emerges beneath the surface. Can you trust what is coming toward you? Can you allow yourself to believe that someone is capable of returning with greater emotional awareness than before? Because the energy surrounding you now strongly suggests that someone is preparing to step back into your world, not as the same emotionally unavailable person they once were, but as someone who finally understands what commitment actually requires. And even though part of you still remembers the hurt, another part of you can already feel the emotional pull drawing them closer. Taurus, however, your story unfolds through courage rather than emotional return alone. The transformation happening around you now feels quieter at first, but it carries enormous long-term potential. Today, Mars enters your first house, and with it comes a surge of determination that feels unfamiliar even to you. Normally, you move carefully, cautiously, protecting your emotional world behind patience and silence. But this transit changes something fundamental inside your spirit. It awakens action. It pushes you toward honesty. At the exact same time, Venus, your ruling planet, enters your third house of communication and forms a harmonious sextile with Mars. This creates a powerful energetic bridge between desire and expression, between feeling something deeply and finally finding the courage to say it out loud. For a very long time, you may have carried conversations inside your mind that never made it into reality. Words stayed trapped behind fear. Feelings remained unspoken because vulnerability felt too risky. Maybe there was an apology you rehearsed countless times but never delivered. Maybe there was someone you wanted to tell the truth to, but could never gather the confidence to reach out. Maybe you convinced yourself that silence was safer than emotional exposure. But today, something changes. The emotional pressure building inside you reaches a point where staying silent becomes more painful than speaking honestly. And the extraordinary part is that the universe is finally supporting your willingness to act. The sextile between Venus and Mars creates flow, momentum, emotional cooperation between heart and action. This is why the timing feels so significant now. The energy no longer resists you, it carries you forward. If there is someone from your past you have been wanting to reconnect with, someone whose absence still lingers quietly beneath your daily life, this may be the exact opening you have been waiting for. The urge to send the message, make the call, or finally show up in an honest way will become increasingly difficult to ignore. And unlike previous moments when fear overpowered you, this time there is steadiness beneath your courage. Mars in Taurus does not create reckless emotional decisions. It creates intentional action rooted in long-term desire. You are not reaching out because you are lonely. You are reaching out because something inside you knows this connection still matters. You are ready to stop avoiding what your heart has been trying to say. And perhaps the most comforting part of this transit is that the emotional current moves both ways. Venus in your third house suggests that communication is mutual. The person you cannot stop thinking about may also be replaying memories of you in their mind. They may be waiting for a sign just as much as you are. And when communication finally begins again, it feels different this time. Less defensive, less confusing, less filled with emotional games. There is openness now, emotional clarity, a willingness to rebuild slowly and honestly instead of repeating old patterns. The foundation that once cracked between you can finally be reconstructed, but this time with greater emotional awareness underneath it. Pisces, though, your experience may feel almost surreal in comparison, because the emotional flow surrounding you is extraordinarily smooth and spiritually charged. With Venus and the Moon entering Cancer, your fifth house becomes illuminated, activating romance, joy, creativity, emotional healing, and the forgotten parts of yourself that still believe in magic. At the same time, these energies form a perfect trine to your sign, creating one of the most naturally harmonious emotional currents imaginable. This is the kind of energy that makes life feel orchestrated by something larger than logic. Synchronicities begin appearing everywhere. Conversations happen at exactly the right moment. Encounters feel destined. Emotional clarity arrives effortlessly. And if there is someone from your past who still occupies a sacred place in your imagination, someone you secretly wondered about during quiet nights when nobody else knew what you were feeling, this transit may finally bring movement into that story. But what makes this different from previous emotional cycles is that you are no longer being asked to abandon yourself in order to receive love. The old version of you accepted emotional inconsistency because you romanticized potential. You settled for fragments because your heart saw possibilities others could not. But Venus in Cancer refuses emotional imbalance. It demands reciprocity. It demands emotional presence that matches your depth instead of merely benefiting from it. So if someone enters or re-enters your life now, they must meet you emotionally instead of expecting you to carry the entire connection alone. This is not fantasy disguised as love anymore. This is emotional maturity, finally entering the dream. The relationship energy surrounding you now feels softer but far more sustainable. Your creativity expands. Your emotional joy begins returning. And perhaps most importantly, you remember what it feels like to be genuinely chosen by someone who sees the real version of you beneath all projections and illusions. That realization changes everything because it allows your heart to stop surviving and start receiving. And as all these energies continue building, the emotional atmosphere intensifies even further. During the night of May 18th, only hours after Venus and the Moon enter Cancer, Venus forms an exact sextile with Mars at approximately 1:30 in the morning on May 19th. This is the turning point. This is when emotion becomes action. Longing transforms into movement. Thoughts that remained unspoken suddenly demand expression. The person who has been silently thinking about you may finally gather the courage to reach out. Or perhaps your own heart reaches a moment where waiting no longer feels possible. Because sextiles create opportunity, they open energetic doors that previously remained closed. Venus in Cancer seeks emotional safety, emotional honesty, and genuine connection. And now Mars provides the courage necessary to pursue it. Mars in Taurus carries a very different emotional language than most people are used to experiencing. It does not promise passion that burns hot and disappears overnight. It promises consistency, effort, presence. It says, if this connection matters, then I will prove it through action over time. Brick by brick, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. And when this grounded Martian energy aligns harmoniously with Venus in Cancer, the emotional atmosphere becomes almost impossible to resist, because suddenly love is no longer just a feeling floating through fantasy. It becomes something tangible, something willing to show up physically, emotionally, and consistently. This is the energy of someone lying awake in the middle of the night, unable to silence your presence in their mind. Not because they are temporarily lonely or seeking validation, but because their heart genuinely keeps returning to you, no matter how hard they try to move forward. This is the energy of someone realizing too late that what they lost carried real emotional value. The kind of value that cannot be replaced through distraction or superficial connection. And because of that realization, people begin gathering the courage to do things their pride once prevented them from doing. Someone who once disappeared may suddenly return carrying honesty instead of avoidance. Someone who once ran from emotional responsibility may finally be ready to speak the words they could not say before. Apologies become more sincere under this energy. Accountability becomes possible. Emotional walls weaken. There is a softness entering human interactions now that makes genuine reconciliation feel attainable in a way it has not for a very long time. You may witness someone finally admitting where they failed you. You may hear the kind of emotional truth you spent months wishing they would say. And equally important, this transit also supports forgiveness. Not blind forgiveness that ignores reality, but mature forgiveness that recognizes growth when it is genuine. The evening of May 18th, moving into the early morning hours of May 19th, carries especially powerful emotional momentum because this is the exact period when the Venus and Mars sextile reaches peak activation. This is the emotional ignition point, the moment when longing transforms into action. Pay close attention during this window because the energy moves quickly and intensely. Notice who suddenly reaches out. Notice which conversations begin unfolding unexpectedly. Notice what your intuition keeps pulling you toward, despite your attempts to rationalize it away. Because hesitation during moments like this can become its own form of self-sabotage. Sometimes, the universe opens a door only briefly to see whether you are finally willing to walk through it. But even within all this beauty and emotional possibility, there is something important you need to understand. Not every person who returns during this transit is necessarily meant to remain in your life permanently. The universe may reopen emotional chapters for healing, closure, or clarity, but that does not automatically mean every reunion leads to forever. And this is where discernment becomes essential. Because while today opens the emotional gates wide, two major tests are approaching immediately afterward. On May 22nd, Venus forms a square with Neptune. This is the illusion test. Neptune clouds perception. It amplifies fantasy, projection, emotional longing, and the tendency to romanticize what we desperately want to believe. During this square, emotions can become dangerously idealized if you are not careful. Someone returning from your past may say everything you hope to hear while lacking the actual stability to follow through. A new romantic connection may appear emotionally perfect on the surface while hiding inconsistencies underneath. This is why grounding yourself emotionally becomes critical. You are allowed to enjoy the magic of this moment. You are allowed to open your heart again. But emotional openness does not require abandoning wisdom. Watch behavior carefully. Observe consistency. Pay attention to whether their actions genuinely align with their promises. Because under Neptune energy, words can become intoxicating, while reality quietly tells a different story underneath. Then, only days later, On May 28th, Venus forms a square with Saturn, and this becomes the commitment test. Saturn does not care about fantasy. Saturn cares about effort, discipline, maturity, accountability, and long-term reality. After the emotional reunions, the heartfelt conversations, and the intense reconnections, Saturn arrives and asks the question nobody can avoid. Are both people actually prepared to do the difficult emotional work required to sustain this connection? Because love alone is not enough without consistency, emotional responsibility, and mutual effort. Relationships that survive both the Neptune square and the Saturn square are relationships with genuine long-term potential. Those are the connections rooted in authentic transformation instead of temporary emotion. Those are the people who not only say they have changed, but prove it through repeated action over time. The connections that collapse under these tests may still have carried emotional meaning, but they were lessons rather than lasting foundations. Today may open the door emotionally, but ultimately you still decide who is allowed to remain inside your life once reality reveals itself fully. So, what should you actually do with this energy while it is active? First, protect your emotional space tonight as much as possible. This is not the kind of transit that thrives in noise, chaos, or emotional distraction. The energy asks for reflection, sensitivity, and openness. Give yourself room to actually hear what your intuition has been trying to tell you. If possible, spend time near water because Cancer energy responds powerfully to emotional environments connected to water. Oceans, lakes, rivers, rain, even a quiet bath can help regulate your emotions and strengthen your connection to the intuitive undercurrent moving through this transit. Most importantly, be radically honest with yourself about what your heart truly wants. Not what looks impressive, not what feels safe, not what other people expect from you. What does your soul genuinely desire emotionally? Venus in Cancer rewards authenticity and emotional vulnerability, not emotional performance. And if someone from your past suddenly reappears, resist the instinct to immediately shut the door out of fear. Listen carefully. Feel the energy beneath their words. Ask yourself whether something truly feels different this time, but at the same time, trust your instincts completely. If your intuition signals inconsistency, emotional manipulation, or unresolved immaturity, do not ignore it simply because nostalgia feels powerful. This transit may be emotionally charged, but your inner knowing remains stronger than any planetary movement. The universe may present opportunities, but you still possess the power to choose what deserves access to your heart moving forward. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is that this transformation does not end tonight. Venus will remain in Cancer for weeks, meaning the emotional recalibration already beginning inside you will continue unfolding gradually over time. Today is simply the opening chapter. Some people will experience dramatic manifestations immediately. Unexpected messages, sudden reunions, encounters that feel impossible to explain logically. Others will experience quieter internal changes, a softening of emotional defenses, a growing willingness to believe in love again, a realization that healing may finally be possible after all. Neither experience is more valid than the other. Emotional transformation unfolds differently for every person. But by the end of this Venus transit, something inside your relationship with love itself will have changed. The fear surrounding vulnerability will weaken. Emotional walls will begin lowering naturally, and the possibility of deep, lasting, emotionally safe connection will stop feeling like a fantasy and start feeling attainable again. For Cancer, Taurus, and Pisces especially, these changes may become impossible to ignore. Someone you thought was gone may genuinely return. And when they do, your heart will recognize the truth almost instantly. You will know whether their presence carries authentic emotional change or merely the echo of unfinished history. Trust that feeling, because your intuition during this period will be sharper than usual. Today, the universe is placing a rare emotional opportunity directly in front of you. The only remaining question is whether you are willing to receive it fully. And if this message found you at the exact moment you needed it, take that as confirmation that your emotional awakening has already begun. Thank you for spending this time here with me. If this resonated with your spirit and you want to continue exploring these powerful astrological shifts together, make sure to subscribe and stay connected for future messages. And if something meaningful is already unfolding in your own emotional world, share your experience in the comments, because your story may help someone else understand what they are feeling too. Until next time, take care of your heart and remain open to the transformations now entering your life.